Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week we're joined by Rick, our mental health consultant, to talk about none other than Jeffrey Dahmer. Just kidding. We are going to touch on that because it was a relevant show. If you guys have not seen it, well, we'll talk about it. But we do want to touch on just kind of serials and like antisocial behaviors because there is such a fascination around this, right? And there are so many people who genuinely are interested in not just serial killers, but like true crime, just like shows. There's all these podcasts. Like I have not tuned into any of those things, so I'm not sure kind of like the format or the reach, but I'm pretty sure they're really, really popular. And obviously anytime that there is like a serial killer documentary or show, it like blows up, and it's this very unique thing. I don't really understand it. So just in general, this show, like anybody who, what was so funny to me was that people were like, who's this guy, Jeffrey Dahmer? You're like, this was happening before I was even born, and I still know all about this guy. You know what I mean? Like this was a really, really like prolific case and person. So for a lot of people, and these are people who were older than me, you know, who I would just observe or talk to me. And I'd hear about them like, who is this? Like, oh, and just like hearing people interject about like what they thought went wrong. Like, oh, just the bad parenting. You're like, that's really all you took from this? Like, that's all you got from this was that this was just bad parenting? I don't know. It was just so interesting that like people up until this show, like did not know who this was.
Yeah. For me, the Jeffrey Dahmer story in particular, growing up in Chicago and being a little bit older, I remember being at my dad's house at his apartment, watching this on TV. I remember listening to the news and them standing outside the apartment while they're wheeling out the acid barrel, and they're bringing out the refrigerator, and they're tearing out boxes of evidence, and they're talking about how there's, you know, human body parts and remains and skulls, and you're just kind of like, I think I was like 11, maybe 12 at the time that this was happening, and so you're just like, what did this person do? Like, they killed him? He was eating them? Like, it didn't make sense. And it was pretty shocking. Chicago in and of itself had already, within the last few years, had a recent serial killer craze with John Wayne Gacy. He was pretty big in the late 70s. And he was alive, obviously in jail, going through his appeal process the whole time. Like, Jeffrey Dahmer was getting arrested, and obviously the TV show parallels the two of them in like one of the final episodes. By the way, there's going to be some spoilers.
There's going to be spoilers. So if you are, we should probably put the timestamp of like when we stop talking about the show in case people want to hear this but they haven't heard it. The show is really good, and I mean, even if you know the story, I still think that it's a really interesting, and they just did a really good job. I thought, from what you remember, did you think that they did a accurate representation? Of course, hey, it's Netflix. They're going to like add certain things, take out certain things, of course, you know what I mean? Like, but it was definitely much creepier than I thought it would be, right? Like so how I even found out about this, I was getting, just like the worst day ever. I was getting a new phone, and remember I called you and you were like, wait, what happened? So I was getting a new phone, and anytime you get a new phone, you guys know it's just a whole few hour process. So I was like, all right, eat my breakfast, take my walks, do all my stuff. I bring my laptop, I bring a protein bar. Like, okay, I'll be set for a few hours while I'll just work. I get there, nothing is working. Okay. Nothing is transferring. iCloud isn't going through. It's not uploading to my computer. Actually, we started uploading it to my computer, and then he unplugged it by accident, thinking it was the old phone. We had to restart that. I was at AT&T for 8.5 hours. So I've obviously worked a lot. I left, I came back, like all these things. So I have no phone for a whole day, which actually was kind of nice. And then I was getting stuff done, but he's like, hey, do you want to watch anything? I'm like, no, I don't really watch anything, man. Like, I appreciate it. He's like, oh, this new show, like Dahmer. And I'm like, Dahmer? And then I look over and I see, like, all I see is the glasses. And I'm like, is there a Jeffrey Dahmer show? They're like, yeah, who's this guy? He's like real weird. And I'm like, we're turning this on. And there was like nobody there at first. And so we were watching it, and they're like, damn, we better be nice to this girl. She's really into this shit. And so I watched the first 3 episodes, which arguably, in my opinion, I think are some of the most like intense episodes. I'm watching them in AT&T. And now at certain points, people are coming in and they're like, what's on? I'm like, it's the new Dahmer show. I'm watching. You guys want to check it out when you come home? Like, it's really good. People are like, what the fuck? Anyway, so I was just surprised at, I mean, they're not showing you, like, it's not a gore film. Like, you're not watching him cut people. In my opinion, though, that is more, I feel like that's a better cinematic experience. Like, I don't like overly gory things for no reason. Like, just hearing something. Like, there was one scene, again, spoiler. There's one scene where, like, the neighbor is, obviously, he lived in an apartment at the end of, like, his career of all this. And he, his neighbor could pretty much hear everything. And there was one very distinct scene, which, like, I just get, like, goosebumps. Like, you hear the guy, like, kind of, like, fighting back, and he's like, no. And then you hear him, like, hit him over the head with something. You hear the thud, and then you hear him taking pictures, like the Polaroid snapping, and then you hear the electric saw go, and then you hear more Polaroids, and then the show ends. And it's like, that to me is creepier than, like, watching it. You know what I mean? Because it's just, like, I don't know. So I thought they did a really good job. And at the end, it was so wild. Like, I did not know that the day that Gacy got, is it called executed?
Executed?
Yeah. He got executed in prison was the day that Dahmer got baptized in prison. And there was also a solar eclipse. Like, what?
Yeah, it's one of those
so wild,
weird moments in life. I didn't even know that was true.
I did fact check that. That was real.
Yeah, I was like, is this really happening?
Because there's so many shows, like in Mindhunter,
yeah,
which another amazing show. We've talked about it before, but like there's one very disturbing aspect of the show, in my opinion, that they added that was not real. And I was like, why?
What was that aspect?
In the second season with Bill's son.
Oh, yeah.
That was the worst part of the show.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely horrified to think that was Bill's poor son. You know what I mean? But that was all fake. Yeah. Like, why would you add this creepy ass shit? Like, the show's already creepy enough. You know what I mean? Like, well, why would you add this? So I was thinking, oh, they probably just added this for, like, the effect, whatever. But I looked it up, and sure as shit.
Yeah, I think in that episode or that season of Mindhunter, what they were trying to do was somehow draw a connection to either childhood trauma and the development of psychopathology in people. I don't think they needed to. I didn't particularly enjoy that angle because the show was really predicated upon the development of the behavioral science unit in FBI in Quantico and how they tracked and developed their profiling system to match serial killers. And so I felt like they really could have stuck with some of the other cases, but I'm not the writer or creator of the show, so I'm in no position to criticize it because I loved that show. In particular, the first season I thought was spectacular.
So just in general, like whenever you watch stuff, it's always like, you know, they're not going to get everything right. So like the show with Dahmer, like there's certainly things that are like added or missing, whatever. But overall, I would say that it was a pretty...
by and large, from what I remember, most of the findings, most of the show was pretty accurate. I think like they took some liberties with
certain things,
one or two of the characters or some of the other stuff that was in it, but the methodology that he used to track people down, the stories behind them, like when I think it was like the 14-year-old boy that was returned to him, you know, him getting pulled over with the dead body in garbage bags in the back seat, which we're going to explain. I'll try and help paint a picture as to how and why these things can happen and why they didn't get caught. And how they respond. Especially
with most serial killers, it's not one thing, right? Which is what was so frustrating. Like hearing people talk about this and they're like, oh, it's just bad parenting. Like that was certainly a big part of it. You know what I mean? Was his upbringing. But there was plenty of people who have even much worse childhoods in that one specific situation. You know what I mean? It's like every single thing that could have gone wrong, I feel like did, you know what I mean? So it doesn't excuse the behavior, but it's like, that's part of what understanding that is. And then it's also just like, I mean, if you watch the show, you hear him say it over and over again. He's like, I'm not crazy. Like I've felt like this for almost my whole life. I've had to repress this for literally since I was like 14. And it's like, that's just such a, I don't know, that's the moral conundrum of like, what do you do with that person? Because it's like, I don't know if even like a better upbringing would that have changed it? Like, you don't know. Well, it's like, it's really hard.
With Dahmer's case, what makes it difficult is, and the show, I think, illustrated this point, that he was exposed to a lot of different drugs, chemicals in utero, meaning as his brain was developing, his mother was taking psychotropic compounds, she was abusing alcohol, she was smoking cigarettes. There's a lot of different things that can create and damage the brain.
He would have had a problem if it wasn't being a cannibal.
Throughout its
He probably would have had a problem in some way.
Yeah.
And that's just so crazy too, like how that went on. But again, she was not the only mom in the world who unfortunately was doing that,
No.
right? There was back then, like, you know, she obviously had her own mental health issues that were exacerbated by being pregnant. But then she was like, oh, well, the doctor is giving these to me. I mean, not the, obviously the cigarettes and the alcohol, but like the doctor is prescribing all of these things, right? It was like 26 medications or something. And it's like, think about how many people, unfortunately, like before we had more like research, went through that. But it's like, it was all of those things added up like together.
There used to never be Surgeon General warnings on packs of cigarettes. I mean, women could smoke. I mean, doctors used to walk into exam rooms smoking cigarettes. They didn't know. You know, you can only know what you know at the time, and as things develop. So I think that's the point. And so one of the things that we'll get into in a little bit is understanding how psychopathology develops in people. And most people believe, most experts in our field believe that psychopaths are born. They aren't a byproduct necessarily of their environment. And I'll get into a little bit what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. And by the way, for all intents and purposes, when you hear the term antisocial personality disorder, that's essentially the diagnostic criteria that we use to define this type of person. The term psychopath and sociopath are no longer used in DSM materials. And when I say antisocial personality, I'm referring to actual behavior traits that like go against societal norms. Not like a person when we like commonly people will say, I'm an antisocial person, meaning I like to withdraw from social engagement and activities. Like I'm more of an introvert. We're not talking about that. When I say antisocial, I'm referring to people who commit violent crimes, who break the law, who have habitual habits of harm and cruelty. So there's a very big difference between how people will use the term antisocial and what it means in a clinical environment. So as we kind of get into that, we'll talk about it. But I personally enjoyed the show a lot from a clinical perspective because I thought they did a really great job. And one of the things that was really kind of fascinating to me that I thought the show did really well was really try and draw an underlying connection between Jeffrey Dahmer's obsession with abandonment and his need to want to keep people with him and this, like, they'll always be a part of me. And I think that's where a lot of the eating of the flesh came from, was this, if they're a part of me, they can never leave me. I'll never be alone. And what you noticed throughout the film was, and this is what I've talked about before when we talk about emotional abandonment. A person can be present in your life in that you can live in the same house as them, but feel absolutely no connection to that person, be completely alone. And so when you look at the mental health history of his mother, she presents as either somebody with severe bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder. More likely, I think they demonstrated some of the features of like the manic depressive states. But also there was this really push-pull relationship between them. Like there's one great scene where he's an adult, and I think he's arguing with his mom, and she's judging him, and she's saying, well, you and your father used to screw around in the basement with your weird ass, taxidermy things and dissecting animals and cutting them up. You're sick and disgusting. But it would have been nice if you asked me to join. It's like, that like literally cut so hard when I heard that. I was like, to me, there's a push-pull there.
Yeah,
there's like,
so
there's this, I'm judging you and condemning you for who you are, but at the same time I'm saying, but you didn't invite me. So his mother took this victim stance. And so she was obviously emotionally and psychologically abusive and a very damaged person. But the father was this workaholic who withdrew from the family completely, and he had no real stability in his life. And I think that was also a great point in the show, was like his father showed up when he was living on his own for an entire summer, and after 3 months his dad finally shows up and is like, Jeffrey, where's your mom? Why isn't she here? I can't believe she would leave you alone. It's like, did you not talk to your son for the last 3 months? Did you not find these things out? Like, let me speak to your mom. Let me know what's happening. You should, these are things that normal parents check up on. They don't just leave their child alone and abandoned in a house. Yeah, but
I think to your point, they did a really good job of sharing that if you understand the kind of psychological background. And he even talked about it, like that the like killing, so to speak, was like his least favorite part. And he always drugged people beforehand, for the most part, because he didn't want them, so he says, to feel pain, right? It wasn't like he was trying to torture people because he wanted to inflict pain on them. He was doing these weird experiments because he's obviously, there's a lot of things going on there, but he, like, the only reasons he did a lot of those things, like, you would see that pattern happen over and over again. Like, somebody would leave or start to leave, and then he'd kill them. You know what I mean? It was like this, like they showed that cinematically so well in like the most like grotesque and awful way. And then obviously at some point it just kind of degenerated. And I don't think that it turned, I think it just got really, really bad after that one, the one guy who he was kind of seen, you know what I mean? So
the
like,
deaf guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll put dating as like a loose term, but like that was one of those things that you were like, okay, maybe this will be like the turning point in his life, you know what I mean? Because it felt like it could have been, and then after that, it just like I feel like the floodgates just opened, at least from what they showed, and at least from everything that you can read, like things just degenerated like really, really fast.
Yeah, and he was never able to establish healthy, connected relationships at any point in his life. He had an absentee father who was in and out of his life, even though I think the show demonstrated his dad tried to take an interest and steer some of his behaviors into healthier ways. We call that sublimation, taking unhealthy responses and channeling them through healthier means. Like if you have an aggressive person, you get them in boxing, right? Or put them in football. It's like, okay, here's a space where you can act out your aggression. And then obviously a severely mentally ill mother who was emotionally and psychologically abusive and neglectful to him just created this abandonment issue in Dahmer. And then
just also not really being, I wouldn't say unintelligent, but not super intelligent,
which
you know?
is common for some serial killers.
So like not
some
really doing well,
very intelligent,
not doing really well in school, not really able to hold a job, not really being a high functioning member of society in really any capacity.
Substance abuse issues.
Heavily, you know what I mean? Like that was definitely one of the, I think that was that was a huge, again, it's like literally everything that could have gone wrong. I feel like at every turn, like did.
Sure.
And that's what I think is so like from just a viewing perspective, like when you can look at these behaviors, it is so interesting to see how all this lines up. And I guess that is the question is like, why are people so obsessed with serial killers?
It's a really great question. The best explanation we can give for it is, if you've listened to our previous podcasts, is the element and the presence of the shadow. And so why are we drawn and mesmerized by serial killers? Well, I think for many of us, it's a way to access this repressed version of ourselves. We see the darkness in other people that we hide from ourselves in our own consciousness. So we actively repress our shadow, right? Which is the aspects of ourselves that we deny, these violent, aggressive, horrific sides of us. And it's triggered and intrigued when we see someone who is such an extreme opposite of what we consider to be our socially acceptable selves. And so we're completely engaged by it because we don't act like that. We have thoughts. Everybody does. How many times does somebody cut you off and you're like, I'm going to fucking kill this person, right? We don't mean it. Okay. And if you've thought that, it's okay as long as you don't act on the impulse. But
we are not supporting acting on these intrusive thoughts, everybody.
Someone who is so willing to accept and play on that side of it, like it's the extreme opposite of where most people in society live. And so I think in many ways for us, watching documentaries on serial killers or trying to understand them is a lot like being on a roller coaster. And what I mean by that is, what's a roller coaster? It's this thrilling ride without any real danger or consequences.
That's not true.
For the most part, most people go on roller coasters year after year and don't get hurt.
But things can go really sideways really quick.
I'm not denying the presence that danger could exist. But how many people get injured on roller coasters? Look at Busch Gardens. There's thousands, millions of people who visit Busch Gardens. And when was the last time you heard of somebody getting injured on a roller coaster? So the idea of it becomes, we like these things because they're thrilling and exciting, but we don't have to take on the consequences of it. And so being able to observe somebody like a Dahmer or a Bundy or some of the other serial killers, it's this way for us to engage this part of us that's repressed in a safe way without ever venturing down that path. We kind of try and understand them as a way of almost understanding ourselves. So, you know, there's other explanations for it too. Some people will say that the behavior of serial killers is kind of like a broader application of their killings is seen as like a larger representation of our society and our culture, in that they depict their killings are depicting the extreme ways that our society has become sick. It's just an extreme representation of what we don't see on a daily basis in our society.
I never thought of that.
Yeah.
I'm more just interested, like we said, like taking all the things that, I mean, I have such a low level understanding of psychology, but like what I do know, I feel like I find it interesting to watch that, to see where things have gone wrong, or to kind of see like, oh, as I'm watching this is because of these abandonment issues. Like I find it interesting because of that. And just like being able to like put those pieces together. But I'm not like, oh, I want to listen to all the true crime stuff, or I want to do like, I'm not really interested in that. I feel like I'd literally never leave my house. I'd be so like fucking crazy.
Well, it can skew your perspective of people. And it does.
For sure.
Because, I mean, this podcast is a little bit more in my wheelhouse because of where I spent the first 10 years of my career. So for a lot of clinicians, they don't have experience talking to or interviewing or working with psychopathic or antisocial personality disorder people. Not every client that I had when I was in prison met that criteria, but there were a fair amount that I did interact with. And so this is where my career kind of started, working in jail systems, both with juveniles and with adults.
Would you be able to like almost feel it like in a conversation, like when you were like in the presence of someone like that? Like, would there be a difference? There
is and there isn't. And this is the part that makes serial killers so intriguing. You look at a guy like Ted Bundy, who had been incarcerated and had multiple run-ins with authority figures. And even while he's in jail, awaiting trial for multiple murders that he's suspected of, the police officers, the jailers, they're all like, oh, Ted Bundy's a great guy. He didn't do this. People had to argue with the detective who started to string together started to link Ted Bundy to the first 5 of his victims. People were like, they were trying to talk the detective out of it. And he had to try and convince people like, no, this is the guy. He meets these criteria. He has these pieces of evidence that he wouldn't have had. And people didn't want to believe him. Law enforcement didn't want to believe him because he's this charismatic, good looking. He was studying to become a lawyer. He had relationships and jobs. He was part of the young Republican
nobody's like, oh
club.
Yeah, Jeffrey Dahmer. Like they're like, all right. Yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer.
He fits the bill.
You're like, makes more sense.
Makes sense.
Because he's this social outcast who's been rejected. He has no real relationships. He's awkward as hell. Right. And I think the show did a great job of demonstrating that. Like,
yeah, the guy who acted, like his acting, just watch it for the acting alone.
I think he'll get an Emmy for it.
He has to win whatever award he can win within that category. He nailed it. I haven't seen the show. He was in, I don't watch American Horror Story, but apparently he was in there too. And he played someone like crazy as well. And he was really good. But yeah, he nailed the acting.
But Bundy and Dahmer are both serial killers, but they're very different personalities, and they're very different in their pathology and the way that they acted out their killings. Dahmer took very little pleasure in killing versus Ted Bundy, who took extreme pleasure in it.
And even like Gacy, they put him in there a little bit. Like he showed, I mean, he was enjoying the torturous aspect of it. And he was still denying that too, which is so crazy.
Yeah, Gacy,
didn't he like deny all of it?
He did, and he didn't. He initially, when he was getting arrested and he was going through interviews, and he had been arrested, and they were starting to link and tie things to him. After his initial arrest, where they knew he would be found guilty, he started working with cooperators, and there's detailed recordings and interviews where he's talking about these killings. Later, after he's been convicted and he's in jail, is when he completely started to deny it and went through this whole process. And so that's the part that most people were exposed to. But he actually drew a diagram for the police and told them in his crawl space where the bodies were, how many there would be, where throughout the house they would be. You know, and he had them underneath the barbecue pit. He had them in the slab of his garage floor that he had resurfaced. He had them in the crawl space of his basement. They literally had to unearth his entire house. And then they demolished it because they were like, we're not rebuilding this. Let's tear it down.
Obviously.
So
if that was my neighbor, I'd be like, bye.
And
moving.
One thing I want to kind of help people understand too is that psychopathic serial killers or antisocial personalities are not always clinically what we would call crazy or insane. Like when we're talking about insane people or people who fit the criteria for psychotic disorders, we're talking about people who experience delusions or hallucinations, disorganized thinking, abnormal motor behavior, things like that are more consistent with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, etc. guys like Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz. I mean, I don't remember David Berkowitz that well. That was the Son of Sam. He was the 44 caliber killer.
I don't think
he might have been legally insane. I don't remember his defense. But like Dahmer, Ted Bundy, they were sane. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was premeditated. It was thought out. It was 100% not the result of like, hallucinations or delusions or people speaking to him and things like that, or, feeling moved or compelled by some other force like outside of them. They knew what they were doing. So they don't necessarily fit the criteria for insanity. Same thing. John Wayne Gacy knew exactly what he was doing. And by the way, if you guys are wondering how many serial killers there actually have been, hundreds. We only know about like the top 10. That's what most people. But there's active serial killer investigations that are happening right now. You can research them if you want on your own time. It's literally hundreds of different serial killers. Okay. Yeah, if you don't want to sleep.
Don't tell me.
Well, and this is the part where, as the therapist, like if my population, if the people that I'm working with have such antisocial traits, it becomes what you see in the world. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that I have some spidey sense where I can detect a psychopath more than anybody else. But there are certain cues and things that I might pick up in a conversation where I'd be like, that guy's not right. Like something's off with him because I've seen it and heard it before.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Like, was there ever like a different kind of just like energy certain people would put out when you would be talking with them? I'm just always interested in that. And again, to your point, not everybody, right? Because some people are trying to play up that like charming kind of individual, and some people are just kind of weird and awkward. But I do like the idea of that really like just malevolent person who you can like feel that intent. Like I just was curious if there was. You
can pick up on it because sometimes what you'll experience is they're taking joy in reliving the experience in front of you by telling you. Sometimes you're trying to determine whether or not they're trying to get shock value from you. Like if I'm talking to you and I'm like, oh yeah, when I used to cut her breasts off, or if I used to violate this person in this way, if you react like what you're doing right now, you're looking down at the floor, you're shaking, that's an arousal for them. Not necessarily a sexual arousal, but an emotional one, a psychological one. They're like, oh my God, I got to her. So they're constantly looking for that type of feedback.
I'd be the worst prison therapist ever.
You might be. But sometimes you can also listen to their stories and they're completely removed from their act. And sometimes you have to determine whether or not that's a byproduct of some of the trauma they've experienced, is to not emotionally attach to significant events in their life or the things that they've done, because they don't want to be held responsible, personally accountable for the things that they did. But, I've never per se sat in a room with a serial killer. I have sat and interviewed people who have killed people before who have not expressed any real remorse over their actions. That's another big thing. Is, people with antisocial personality disorder, they don't experience or express any level of remorse for the things that they've done. And that's what really separates them from, say, like a narcissistic person. So let me kind of get into some of that.
Let's get into some of the differences.
Yeah. So first and foremost, all psychopaths or antisocial personalities are narcissists. Okay, I want you guys to know that. But not all narcissists are psychopaths. Very important distinction to make. And when we talk about, you'll hear these phrases thrown about, you'll hear psychopath and you'll hear sociopath. They essentially mean the same thing. The major difference between them is that psychopaths are born and sociopaths are made. And this is where the argument for bad parenting comes into play. And I'll even talk about one or two of the case studies that I worked on that illustrate this point even further. So a psychopath is somebody who has and does not experience any remorse. They have no guilt, no shame, no real embarrassment at all. They are completely void of care for other people's consequences, like what happens to them. You are a tool to service me. The whole world exists as a way for me to seek pleasure. People who are great psychopaths oftentimes can be killers, assassins. They can be business people who are responsible for coming in and like doing mass firings because they legitimately don't care. Like some of the top CEOs in the world probably would be psychopaths because they can make decisions that impact the lives of hundreds or thousands of people and completely destroy their lives and not lose any sleep over it. And so just like a psychopath, narcissists also lack empathy. They're entitled. They're grandiose, arrogant. They constantly seek validation. Where narcissism separates from psychopathology is that narcissistics are a disorder of self-esteem. Okay? And so everything that they're doing is about getting validation and making themselves feel good and think that they're superior and think that the world exists to serve them. A narcissist can have empathy for other people. Like, they'll do wrong and they'll be like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I know, that was bad. I know that I hurt that person. And they'll experience some level of remorse. Whereas a psychopath is the exact same person, but will hurt somebody and absolutely not care. Like, they'll kill you and not try to get any on their shoes because they don't want to ruin their shoes, right? So there's like zero remorse in their actions. And so that's the major difference really between them. When it comes to understanding psychopaths and sociopaths, again, same kind of concept. They're essentially the same, but what I mean is a sociopath is more or less is created and not born. You look at Jeffrey Dahmer, would fit the criteria for psychopathology, right? You look at him and you're like, he was born that way. Now, he did not grow up in a nurturing environment that did anything to change that, but you can make an argument that it was the in utero drug exposure, the mental health, all that stuff. But Dahmer even himself has always felt like he was born different from everybody else, and he never truly felt like he fit into society. Sociopaths are made. And so what I mean is they're taught to be criminals and they're taught to be kind of antisocial. And so what I mean by that is, imagine if I'm a father, which I am, imagine if I'm teaching my son the ways to lie, cheat, steal, and manipulate society and people in it. He's not growing up with like a normal view of society. He's being taught these things. So if you expose somebody to a criminal element long enough, they become criminals. Case in point, I remember one of my very first clients that I got, I was working in a juvenile treatment facility at the time. It was a substance abuse facility. And I've had a couple sessions with this client, this kid, this adult. He was like 16 or 17. I forget how old he was. And we were talking about his propensity for selling drugs. And I was the first person to tell him, I was like, you don't have to sell drugs. There's other ways for you to make money. Well, later that week, he had a phone call with his mother. And he was talking about his therapy sessions. And he was telling his mom, he's like, yeah, my therapist says, there's other ways to make money and all that. So the next time I went to go get this kid for his session, he's like, yeah, my mom wants to talk to you. So I was like, okay. So I call mom. I'm like, hey, and I've got it on speakerphone. She started cussing me out in ways that you can't even believe. Who the fuck do you think you are to tell my son he's not supposed to sell drugs? You don't have a fucking right to do that. He's got a responsibility to take care of his family. He has to earn money for this family. You shut your fucking mouth. You don't tell him what to do. And I'm just like, this was the first experience I had ever had with this. And I'm like, I was simply trying to tell him to impose my value system on him, which is essentially what I was doing. I didn't know that I was really doing that, but I'm like, hey, you get that there's other ways to make a living. But in his mind, in his family, the culture had been, this is how you're going to earn money. Mm-hmm. So he was a kid who was taught the game, the street game, the hustle at an early age, didn't know any other life existed except this is how I make money. This is how I earn a living. Sociopathic, not psychopathic, because he was taught. It was created within him, not something that he was necessarily born with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But then how does would you say that somebody who is, like, if we're talking about like the creating part to become like creating that like killer, do you think that both of those things have to come together? Because like most people aren't encouraging, encouraging someone to like murder multiple people. Do you see what I'm saying?
They're not encouraging it. Some families do, by the way, okay, but with the exception of those,
okay.
I think it's just a matter of, at a certain point, it becomes,
or do you mean like
an impulse within that individual?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand, or break that down in case maybe anybody else is trying to understand. Maybe it's just me.
Well, you look at, so take a look at the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Mm-hmm. What did you start to see early on when he was a child? You started to see the tadpole mutilation, early, or animal torture is a common thing where a lot of people will start off because it's a safer way of experimenting. Mm-hmm. How did it feel? How did it feel when they first did that? Did it feel good? What were the sensations that they had? Oftentimes you'll hear things like, I felt powerful, I felt in control, I felt strong.
But that's not society shaping it.
Huh?
How is that like other people shaping
That's the
that?
psychopath part.
Yeah, that's the psychopath part. But how does the sociopath part develop, I guess?
Well, if you're exposed and you're not taught any other way to live.
Got it. Okay.
Like, this is what it is. Like,
okay.
My version of problem solving is to talk to somebody, figure things out, find a mutual ground, right? If all I show my son is every time somebody picks on him to get up and go grab a brick and smash him in the face, he's not going to know how to talk his way out of problems. He's just going to be like, violence is how you solve problems. Okay. And so you grow up in a violent culture. You'll see people, as they develop later in life, they'll start to question their belief systems and the things that they grew up with, and they'll have a hard time with it. Like Stanley Tucci was one of them. Or is it Stanley Tucci? The leader of the Crips? He was one of the most violent gang members in the world, and when he was sentenced in prison to life in prison, he started to finally challenge and connect different things to his upbringing, and he became like a child's author. He became an anti-gang advocate. He started to do things to bring the Bloods and the Crips together to greatly reduce gang violence. And it's like, how did one of the most prolific violent gang members completely turn around? And so there's an example of like later in life they can start to question these things. But when you're young, your moral development hasn't arrived, and especially if the people in your life are creating violence for you, that's what you're going to be. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, there's always this argument, like some people believe that like you can't be born essentially like a bad person. And I don't want to put like a moral label on it, but when we're talking about fucking serial killers, I think everybody can agree that you're not a great person and you're a terrible person if you're doing this, right? So the idea that like some people think that you can't be born bad essentially, but it's like, I don't know, I feel like there's certain things that are just unexplained in certain people, that it's like so many things can go wrong, but it's also like I feel like there has to be something underlying here, because a lot of people have a lot of things that are wrong and they're not doing that, you know? Right. So I do feel like it is that like nature and nurture together, because there's absolutely no way that you can tell me that like, I don't know, and that's the part where when you start analyzing the pathology and the etiology of serial killer development, it's not a clear-cut path. It's very abstract. It's like, why is one person a serial killer and another person who experienced the exact same thing a completely different person? There's a great book that actually talks about this. I don't know, or not talks about this particular, but for those of you who are interested in reading it, it's called The Gift of Fear. It's a book written by Gavin DeBecker. Kevin DeBecker is one of the foremost authorities in the world on predicting violent behavior. He's a security specialist. He's like developed security details for high-level executives, presidents, politicians, VIPs, celebrities, etc. Well, in this book, he details his entire career. There's one really great chapter in this where he's working with inmates who are like in a halfway house. And what he experiences is with one of these guys, he's talking to one of these like reforming criminals, that the two of them essentially had the exact same upbringing. Like, he's listening to his story and he's like, I remember this. Like, we had the same life. And at one point, the inmate looks at him. He's like, you and I are the same person. He's like, explain to me why I'm in a halfway house and I've lost everything and I'm a career criminal. But you have a beautiful wife, kids, a home, a successful career. How did we end up this way? We both had the same experience, but we became different people, and why? And the only thing he can point to is he's like, along the way, I had the right guidance at the right time. It's kind of like, if I'm a seed, I got watered just at the right moment to make it to the next level, where this person didn't get any water. And so they were left to struggle or find things. And when you're in a space of survival, you don't question things. It's like, I do this or I die. You start throwing morality out the window. And when you grow up in a morally absent environment, you don't have an overdeveloped superego. You have an underdeveloped one. And more to the point, you have an overdeveloped or powerful id, if we're going to go down like the Freudian pathology, which I'll get into in a second. And so it just becomes a byproduct of the environment that the person is growing up in, where they're never nurtured or taught to sublimate those things into healthier activities. I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, at that point, there should have been certain things, and that was lacking. I think Correct. That would probably crystallize that for a lot of people. So I do think that there probably is a certain aspect of like what these people are born with potentially, and then all of these things either going wrong or just not happening when maybe they should have been stopped or behaviors adjusted.
And so when you're looking at like the series like Dahmer, one of the questions that people kept asking is, they were like, Why didn't the cops check the garbage bags when he got pulled over, right?
I wouldn't have thought to check the garbage. Well, would you?
I'm not a cop. I can't answer that. I don't know.
I guess.
It is
I'm not a cop either.
It's a little weird. I don't remember what time at night it was for a guy to be driving with 3 garbage bags in the back seat.
I guess. I thought that was just kind of like a luck that he didn't get. Because, like, I mean, you really could have had leaves in there.
He could have. And they could have checked and just poked one of them to see.
I guess.
I don't know. Maybe you could have a police officer on and talk to him about that. Like, what would have been the...
When you see a garbage bag, what do you do?
I think sometimes, though, that they didn't want to see that. And I think that was the point.
Oh, for sure.
Several episodes that allude to the idea that everybody had their eyes closed and wasn't looking at what was obviously in front of them.
Yes.
And this is the power that a serial killer actually has, is in our minds... Again, with the shadow, we want to reject everything that has to do with violence and aggression and these ugly sides of us. So as a result, we tend to, in our minds, create a mental image that a serial killer has to look like a monster. Like they're going to be different from us. They're going to have fangs and bleed from their eyes and be this horrible, ghastly individual. And the reality is they are us. So if you've listened to the Shadow podcast that we did on shadow work, you'll recognize that when I'm saying acknowledging these things exist as a part of us, that whatever is in Jeffrey Dahmer actually exists in you and some of these other people. And most of us, when I make a statement like that, everybody's like, no, fuck that, not me, right? And it's this inability to want to connect with it. And I'm not saying that you're Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm saying that you're a human being. And despite whatever platform you want to stand on, Jeffrey Dahmer was a human being. And so whatever was comprised in him, if you had grown in those same areas and developed in those same ways, it's not that far-fetched. And so what makes serial killers a little bit different is their autonomic nervous system, which is part of the sympathetic nervous system, which is where the fight, flight, and freeze responses are, like the fear center of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic system. They have an underdeveloped autonomic nervous system, which means their brain doesn't register arousal in the same way that ours does. So like when you do something wrong, when you're, I don't know, like speeding down the road in excess and all of a sudden the cops pull you over, you see the sirens and the lights.
Panic.
You hear the sirens and see the lights. Sorry. You start to panic, right? You get that nervous feeling in your stomach. They don't have that, which is why they're able to stay cool, because their brain doesn't register fear in the same way. It doesn't become aroused. Theirs is flat. Doesn't matter. Which is why they can get away with doing the things that they're doing and have no real reaction to it. So they're very different. In a normal person, when your that autonomic system fires up, when you break a rule or you do something wrong, you feel nervous, you feel anxious. You're responding to the potential consequences to come. They don't think about consequences. They're highly impulsive people, and arrogant in a lot of ways. And so they're not going to get caught. And they're narcissistic and they think they're entitled to do these things. And think about that combination of being entitled and arrogant and thinking that you exist to serve me and to pleasure me, and I can take and do whatever I want whenever I want. And I have no remorse or fear about it.
That was the craziest part about like BTK's whole story, is how literally he got away with it for 20 years, and then he was such a narcissist that he continued to write into the cops, or just write in stuff about it because he wanted to be known. And it's like, dude, what? That's how you got caught, is not because of all of the gruesome, awful things that you did. You got caught because you basically turned yourself in because you wanted people to know about what you had done. That is just narcissism on a different fucking level. That has always been so wild to me. Yeah. To think that that's how he got caught.
Yeah. So just to kind of get into some of the other criteria that define antisocial personality disorder and what that looks like. Failure to conform to societal norms concerning lawful behaviors, such as performing acts that are grounds for arrest. So breaking and entering, using weapons, arson, drug dealing, things like that. Being deceitful, most of them are complete pathological liars. And they take pleasure in lying and being able to deceive and manipulate and conning other people. They're highly impulsive. They don't plan. They're irritable and aggressive. Oftentimes you see a long history of physical fights, assaults, aggression. They have a reckless and complete disregard for the safety of other people. consistently irresponsible. Oftentimes they have difficulty sustaining work, relationships, etc. They don't really meet a lot of obligations. And then again, they lack remorse. Being indifferent or being able to rationalize hurting people without any real empathy for it. That's kind of the defining characteristics. And by the way, you only need to meet 3 of those criteria to be considered antisocial. However, one caveat to that is you do need to demonstrate a pattern of these behaviors prior to the age of 15.
Really?
Yeah. It has to be a long, consistent, pervasive pattern of it.
Okay, well, what if you're from 30 to 50, you're on this spree of behavior? Nobody would consider that.
Well,
I mean, obviously the chances of you getting caught are pretty high, but I mean, maybe not.
How many people at age 30 become serial killers without any of the other precursors prior to 15? That's my point.
Or antisocial behavior in general.
That's my point. In order to have the diagnosis of antisocial personality, you have to be displaying these things prior to 15. Now, some people might say, we don't have an accurate history. We don't know. Yeah. They're great at lying. So unless you have witnesses to some of these events, they can very easily just lie about what their history has been. And so it becomes a difficult thing to prove. And if you're under the age of 18, what you're looking at, the term would be, like if I'm dealing with a teenager who... Antisocial personality disorder fits the same criteria essentially as conduct disorder, but that's the diagnosis that we use for people under the age of 18. And so sometimes what we've had people who have demonstrated a pervasive pattern, like from age 12, you can see signs of criminality. And not just criminals, but like the lack of remorse, empathy,
not like, I
cruelty to people, etc. And so they're oftentimes diagnosed with conduct disorder. And then once they turn 18, as long as the pattern continues to persist, they'll eventually be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder.
I guess I never thought about that. But yeah, most people aren't going to be like, turn 30th birthday, going to be going to change my life around and become an antisocial personality.
You don't turn it around.
I meant in a negative way. I meant like you weren't doing those the first 30 years and all of a sudden now.
Correct.
Like most people, I guess, aren't doing that.
If you were a perfect person, let's just assume a totally normal person, then at age 30, you just like snapped.
Yeah.
Most people would start to look for some sort of external stressful event that happened in your life.
That'd be like a psychotic break, probably, right?
Potentially, yeah. Or something else that triggered these events. And that wouldn't be necessarily... indicative of the fact that like your entire life you had been sublimating this, as much as it would be like you snapped under stress and under duress and you committed these acts, and that would be that might be something more along the lines of a psychotic disorder. Yeah. Right. Not necessarily antisocial personality.
Interesting.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I had some other stuff. I don't know what we're at for time in terms of moral development. We wanted to get into
Touch
that.
on their favorite thing to wrap it up.
My favorite thing to wrap it up. Okay.
Your favorite of the list.
Okay. I don't know. I'll go back.
You on the spot.
I'll touch on the Freudian part and how this kind of develops into, and it demonstrates where psychopathology kind of has some of its origins. So Freud talked about a moral code, and this will help you guys understand the psychopath part, the sociopath part, etc. Freud talked about the internalization of a person's moral code. Usually it's our parents that represent our moral code. Well, there's 3 levels of consciousness that he identified. You have the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious awareness, right? Which are defined by the id, ego, and superego. Okay. So the id is the unconscious part. This is the selfish part, the impulsive part, the instinctual part. This is like where sex and eating and aggression, the pleasure centers of the brain. Okay. That's what this is. This is a pleasure-seeking principal part of you. It is like, some people will describe it as kind of like the devil part of you, like the evil part, so to speak. Then there's the superego, which is the preconscious, which is like, so if the unconscious is the deepest part, we're moving up one step, which is the preconscious, which is the superego. This is like an internal guiding principle. This is where concepts of right or wrong, moral principle come into play. What is socially acceptable to think and feel. These are these guiding principles. So in many ways, it's kind of like the opposite of the id, which is like the the God version, the God complex, right? This is like the angel on your shoulder, so to speak. So you have the devil and you have the angel. Well, they need a counterbalance in between them, which is the third level up, which is what we call the conscious, which is the ego. And the ego's responsibility in these decisions is kind of like to take into account the reality principle, which is it's the balance between these two forces. And you all have this. Think about a time in your life when you knew you had something to do, a project to work on, but there's this part of you that doesn't want to engage in it, and so you find other things to distract. Like you jump on social media, right? That's what is social media. It's a pleasurable thing. It's a dopamine dump, right? So what are we seeing? You're seeing your id come into play right there, where your superego is saying to you, hey, you have this responsibility, go and do this. You're supposed to be doing laundry right now, but instead you're screwing around on the phone.
Laundry sucks.
Right? So eventually what happens is your ego steps in, weighs the pros and cons, and then makes the decision to say, look, we're going to be a responsible adult and go do these things. That's the representation of it. Now, what happens if the internalization of the parent's moral code is absent from that person, or the moral code is corruption, right? An example of this would be like if my father was a police officer. It stands to be that I would grow up with a strong ethical background, right? I might have an overdeveloped superego, this sense of righteousness or a strong ethical command, right? Where I wouldn't break any rules ever and would feel very uncomfortable doing that. Why? Because of the moral compass that was instilled in me as a child. Well, what happens if no one ever teaches me right from wrong, or more importantly, that it's socially acceptable to hurt, harm, lie, cheat, steal, and be aggressive? Well, the id is overdeveloped, and there's nothing to counterbalance it. So you become a highly impulsive, highly aggressive individual. Oftentimes, these people don't have a sense of morality to them. And so since there's no remorse, they act on their pleasure. And so they kind of develop these patterns of abuse. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And it really does point to like there's so many layers here. So I think that that's probably part of the fascination, going back to that first question, like why do people enjoy watching this or learning about it? You know what I mean? And I guess part of it could be the shadow stuff or this deeper concept of like what's happening in society. But I also do think that some people are just curious about, I don't know, maybe I'm just trying to justify how I think about it. But like, cause I would never want to watch like a regular true crime stuff. I don't know. But I also don't like, I was just talking about this earlier. Like I don't like horror films. Like anything like paranormal, like, oh hell no. Like that's just like the absolute worst. You know what I mean? But like the serial killer stuff, you know, shows or documentaries, whatever, is interesting. And I think it's just because like in a horror movie, like you don't know what's going to happen next. Obviously with all of this, like you already know what's happened, you know what I mean? So like you're watching it as everything is over or done. And then you can just like observe like what's happening. So I think that's why it's like not as, scary, I guess, like to me versus like watching something like The Exorcist, you know what I mean? Or something like that. I'd be like, absolutely not. Like what's going to happen next? Who's going to like anything like, oh my God, it's like my worst nightmares to like watch movies like that, or like just those weird torture movies. Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean,
I do not know how people get into shit like that, but everybody likes different
and
stuff.
Some people like that. And
some people love that. I just get super, super scared about that stuff. And I'm like, I always wondered like why, you know what I mean? And I think that's the reason, is because you're trying to, you don't know what's going to happen. Whereas like with these shows, like, I mean, the person's already caught, convicted, probably dead. And you're just kind of filling in the details. Like, well,
you're seeing it from that spectrum perspective. You're like, hey, I'm on this. We're all as human beings on this spectrum. How did this one person end up so far over here and in such an extreme case? Like, and I think part of that mesmerizing part is, God, is this like, could I have done this? Is this in me? And that's kind of that acknowledgement piece that keeps you intrigued on that level. And it's a scary thing.
It is really scary to think, wow, somebody who is similar enough to me, obviously very different, but similar enough that like did this so easily. Like that's so horrifying to think of. Like, so obviously we've talked about a lot of different things today, but if you have not watched the show yet, you've been living under a rock, we would definitely recommend it. It does a pretty good job. And I just think cinematically, like even taking the story aside, I think cinematically they do a really great job, which is probably why I liked it so much too. Like those little details. Some people thought it was too slow because of that, but like I appreciate stuff that's slow, that like builds the story if it is filmed and like acted out really well. So if you like that kind of stuff, It's pretty good. And yeah, hopefully you guys now have better understanding of psychopathic behavior and all these different things. And like I said, clearly people are interested in this, and it's always like been on my mind, like, why are some people so interested in this? So hopefully this clears it up for you guys. And if you guys are interested in reaching out to Rick for therapy, not related to serial killing, for other things, we will put his contact below. And yeah, we'll talk to you guys next week.